It is 3:30 in the morning on December 19th, 1944, and the temperature outside Bastogne has fallen well below freezing. Snow lies thick across the Ardennes forest, and in the darkness a column of American lorries grinds along an icy road, headlights masked to slits, engines straining in low gear. Inside the vehicles sit the men of the 101st Airborne Division, woken from a rest camp in France with barely a day's notice, issued whatever ammunition could be found in the depot stores, and told almost nothing except that the Germans had broken through somewhere to the east. Many of them do not yet have winter coats. Some do not have enough bullets to fight a sustained battle. What they are about to do, without quite knowing it yet, is become the cork in a bottle that the entire German offensive in the west cannot get past. 7 roads meet at Bastogne, threading through the hills and forests of Belgium like spokes on a wheel, and whoever controls that town controls the only way for a mechanized army to move quickly through this stretch of country in December. Adolf Hitler's last great gamble in the West, an offensive he had codenamed Wacht am Rhein, depended on tanks moving fast enough to reach the River Meuse and beyond before the Allies could react. Every planner in the German High Command understood that speed was the entire plan. Without Bastogne's road network, that speed simply did not exist. This is the story of how a scratch American garrison, appalling weather, and a fuel crisis that German planners had gambled everything on solving as they went, combined to stop Hitler's panzers dead in the snow, and why, for all their armor and all their audacity, they never made it into the town at all. By the 5th year of the war, Nazi Germany's military machine was running on fumes in the most literal sense imaginable. The Ardennes offensive was conceived not from strength but from desperation. Allied bombing had reduced German synthetic fuel production by roughly 2/3 over the course of 1944, and the Wehrmacht's planners knew, even as they drew up the attack, that they did not have anywhere near enough petrol stockpiled to get their panzer divisions from the start line to their final objective at Antwerp. The solution the German High Command settled upon was audacious to the point of recklessness: capture Allied fuel dumps along the way and refuel from the enemy. It was a plan that depended on speed, on surprise, and on roads remaining open and passable. Bastogne sat directly across the path of 2 entire panzer corps, and if it could not be taken quickly, the whole timetable would begin to unravel. The Americans, for their part, had not expected an attack here at all. The Ardennes was considered a quiet sector, a place to rest battered divisions and blood-green ones, which is precisely why the German plan worked as well as it initially did. When the offensive opened on December 16th with a 90-minute artillery bombardment along an 80-mile front, thin American lines were overrun in places within hours. Whole battalions were encircled. Communication broke down. For the first 2 days, Allied commanders in the rear were not even certain of the scale of what was happening, and some believed it might be a local spoiling attack rather than the largest German offensive since 1940. Into this fog and confusion, the order went out to move whatever forces could be found towards the crossroads town that intelligence officers had circled on their maps as the single most important piece of ground in the entire sector. There was no time to properly supply them, no time to dig in with anything but entrenching tools against frozen ground, and, most critically of all, thick cloud had settled over the Ardennes, grounding the Allied air forces that would ordinarily have shredded any German armored column moving in daylight. For a few days the panzers had almost total freedom of movement, and Bastogne appeared to be there for the taking. The garrison that assembled at Bastogne over the days that followed was less a coherent plan than an improvisation built from whatever the American army could throw into the gap. The 101st Airborne Division formed the backbone. Roughly 11,000 paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy and Holland earlier that year and who arrived at Bastogne not by parachute but crammed into open lorries, without their full complement of heavy weapons, artillery, or winter clothing. Alongside them fought stragglers and remnants of shattered units, engineers who had been building bridges days earlier, tank destroyer crews from the 705th Battalion, and gunners from the 755th and other artillery units who had managed to pull their guns back from the collapsing front rather than abandon them. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting division commander, found himself directing a defense with roughly a third of the artillery he would normally expect and no reserve to speak of, arranging his forces in a rough perimeter around the town rather like the spokes of the very road wheel the Germans needed to break through. The technical mismatch between the two sides was stark and worth explaining properly, because it explains why the defenders had to rely on ingenuity rather than firepower. The German spearhead approaching from the south and east included Panther and Tiger tanks, machines that outgunned almost anything the Americans could put against them in a straight contest. A Panther's long 75mm gun could punch through the frontal armor of an American Sherman tank at ranges where the Sherman's own 75mm gun could barely scratch the Panther's front plate, a disparity crews on both sides understood well from bitter experience earlier in the campaign. The Americans compensated with the M18 Hellcat, a tank destroyer built for speed rather than protection, its designers having stripped away armor to the point where soldiers joked it was built from little more than sheet steel, in exchange for a top speed of around 55 kilometers an hour, roughly twice that of a Sherman, that let crews dart to a firing position, loose off a shot, and retreat before German gunners could properly range in. Combined with dug-in artillery firing over open sights and bazooka teams operating in pairs from foxholes at close range, the defenders built a defense based on mobility, concealment, and concentrated fire at choke points rather than any hope of matching German armor tank for tank. By December 20th, German units of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by elements of Panzerlehr, had encircled the town completely, cutting the last road out and leaving roughly 18,000 American soldiers and an unknown number of Belgian civilians sealed inside a perimeter perhaps 8 kilometers across. What followed was a week of siege warfare conducted in temperatures that regularly fell to minus 15 degrees Celsius, with wounded men freezing to death in aid stations that had run out of morphine, plasma, and blankets, and combat medics performing amputations by torchlight using whatever surgical instruments the retreating hospital units had left behind. On December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce carrying a written demand for surrender, warning of the town's complete annihilation by German artillery if the garrison did not comply within 2 hours. McAuliffe's reply, delivered back through the lines in writing, consisted of a single word that has become one of the most quoted responses in American military history: nuts. The German officers, by most accounts, required the accompanying American major to explain what the word actually meant before they departed. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there is a great deal more to this story still to come. The siege held through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, days remembered by survivors for the German bombing raids that struck the town center, killing dozens of civilians sheltering in cellars, and for a renewed German ground assault on Christmas morning involving roughly 20 tanks that broke briefly into the western perimeter before being destroyed or driven back by American gunners and armor that had by then arrived to reinforce the town. The decisive shift, however, came from the sky rather than the ground. On December 23rd, the weather that had grounded Allied aircraft for a week finally cleared, and transport aircraft began dropping supply bundles by parachute into the perimeter, delivering ammunition, medical supplies, and food to a garrison that had been rationing everything for days. Fighter bombers followed, free at last to hunt the German columns strung out along the narrow forest roads outside the town, roads that offered no cover and no room to disperse. Comparison with the German offensive elsewhere along the front is instructive here. Further north, Kampfgruppe Piper, the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division equipped with even heavier King Tiger tanks, had advanced further and faster than any other German force in the opening days of the offensive, only to run catastrophically short of fuel near the village of L'Église, forced eventually to abandon dozens of armored vehicles and escape on foot. The fuel crisis that doomed Piper's advance was the same crisis gripping the forces trying to take Bastogne, and it is difficult to overstate how much the entire German plan depended on captured Allied fuel dumps that, in the event, were mostly destroyed or evacuated before they could be seized. General George Patton's Third Army, meanwhile, had executed one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war in the West, wheeling 90 degrees from its positions further south and advancing over 160 kilometers in a matter of days across icy roads to reach the encircled town. On December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division punched a narrow corridor through the German lines near the village of Ardennes, and the siege of Bastogne was, for practical purposes, broken. The Germans did not immediately abandon the effort, mounting further attacks against the corridor into early January in an attempt to sever it and restore the encirclement. But the town itself never fell, and the road network at its center never passed into German hands. Set against the American defense, the German attempt at Bastogne looks less like a triumph of armor and more like a demonstration of what armor cannot achieve without fuel, without air cover, and without the roads it needs to maneuver. The material effect of holding Bastogne was significant but arguably secondary to its psychological and strategic weight. The German timetable, already strained by unexpectedly stubborn resistance across the whole Ardennes front, could not absorb the days lost trying to reduce the town, and every day spent besieging Bastogne was a day the wider offensive did not spend advancing towards the Meuse. Historians continue to debate precisely how much the delay at Bastogne alone changed the outcome of the wider battle, since American resistance elsewhere along the front, improved weather, and the sheer logistical impossibility of Germany's fuel situation were all working against the offensive simultaneously, and it would be an overstatement to credit one town with single-handedly deciding the Battle of the Bulge. What is not in dispute is that Bastogne became, almost immediately, the symbolic center of the entire battle in the American public imagination, its defenders known ever after as the battered bastards of Bastogne, a nickname the soldiers themselves rather enjoyed. The battle's influence on later military thinking was considerable too, reinforcing for American planners the value of holding road junctions and defended perimeters even when surrounded, rather than attempting fighting withdrawals that risked disintegration under pressure. Several of the Sherman tanks, artillery pieces, and even a Panther recovered from the fighting can still be seen today in and around Bastogne itself, most notably at the Bastogne War Museum, while the McAuliffe roundabout in the town center, marked by a Sherman tank on a plinth, stands more or less where the American command post once operated. Return for a moment to that column of lorries grinding through the darkness on December 19th, men who did not know if they carried enough ammunition to last a single day of serious fighting. What they achieved over the week that followed was not glamorous. There was no decisive tank battle, no single dramatic charge that turned the tide. There was cold and hunger and men holding foxholes because the alternative was worse, and gunners firing over open sights because there was no time to do anything cleverer. And yet, the effect of all that grinding, unglamorous endurance was to deny Nazi Germany the one thing its entire offensive had been built around from the very first day of planning: speed. Every hour the panzers spent stalled outside Bastogne was an hour the fuel tanks did not have to spare, an hour the weather clock ran down towards the day the skies would clear and the Allied air forces would return, an hour that Patton's tanks used to close the distance from the south. The panzers that were meant to be racing towards Antwerp within days instead found themselves fighting for a market town in the snow that they never actually took. Hitler had gambled his last strategic reserve on speed and audacity, on tanks that could outfight anything in their path and a plan that assumed the enemy could be bypassed or bulldozed before he had time to organize. What he had not gambled on was a garrison with almost nothing to fight with deciding, quite simply, that it would not move. The panzers never made it into Bastogne. They circled it, they bombarded it, they demanded its surrender, and in the end they left it exactly as they found it. In American hands, its 7 roads still closed to them, its defenders still there. That, in the end, is the whole story of why the offensive failed. Not because the tanks were beaten in open battle, but because a crossroads town refused to give them the one thing they needed most, and time, once lost in the Ardennes snow, was never given back.